My name is Jennifer Gray Thompson, and I am the CEO of After the Fire. Welcome to the podcast, How to Disaster: Recover, Rebuild, and Reimagine. In this podcast, we bring you the very best practices, best hearts, and great ideas from other disaster-affected communities. Thank you for joining us. Welcome to the podcast. Today, our guest is Renae Hanvin. She's the founder and director of Corporate to Community, which is based in Melbourne, Australia. I'm really excited to have Renae on today because even though it didn't go in order, she was actually my very first podcast guest. And I have a whole clip of her being very patient from Australia as I was trying to do this alone. It's before I had help from Kyle. And it took, I think, 3 or 4 times for us to get the podcast in because I forgot to hit record and I was very nervous. Here we are about a year later, and we're going to take up our conversation, not really where we left off, because this has been a very incredible, intense year. And so I'm so happy to have you here with me today. And just as a reminder, I am Jennifer Gray Thompson. I'm the CEO of After the Fire. We last had Renae on in season 1, and then at that time we discussed corporate responsibility after a disaster, especially in how long-term recovery for communities really starts after the 1-year anniversary. Often charitable donations arrive immediately, but disaster recovery is a very long process. Many of us in the industry refer to it as a slog. Today, we're going to focus on compounding disasters and how communities are responding to them, resilience funding, and how businesses are pivoting to be more resilient in response to multiple disasters. In the description below, you can find out more about Renae at www.corporate2community.com. We'll also provide a link to her first episode and more. Thank you, everyone, for joining us today, and to our guest, Renae Hanvin. Renae Hanvin, you are back with us again on the How to Disaster podcast. And I'm so very happy to see you. We started chatting right away before we hit record. And I just want to thank you so much for coming back a year later.
Welcome. Thanks so much for having me. I can't believe, wow, what's happened in a year. Crazy.
Well, actually, a lot has happened in a year. And so I thought we could just sort of dive into that right away. One of the things that, we were talking about that you're going to address is what's gone on in your neck of the woods. You are based in Australia specifically with disasters of all kinds and the concept of compound disasters and response.
Yeah, 100%. So I think last time we spoke, we'd obviously had the horrible bushfires that had impacted so much of Australia. And then, of course, as the recovery was starting to kick in, and as you know only too well, the recovery, there's that short, medium, long term. So we're just getting through the short-term recovery, moving into the slightly longer-term recovery. And of course, COVID hit. So you're recovering communities while there's a pandemic, and Australia had certain measures. We went into lockdowns and that quite quickly for quite a long period of time. But on top of that, we had, we've still got drought in so many of our country areas. We had storms. So a lot of communities that were recovering from bushfires and other communities lost power for like weeks at a time. We then had floods in other areas in northern New South Wales. So again, those communities are now dealing with floods. We had tornadoes recently. I'm in Melbourne, we're the biggest lockdown city in the world. I think we earned that title, which is, it's not a great title to have. And then I was literally on the phone to a client a few weeks ago, talking to them about a potential media crisis relating to COVID as the building's shaking and we had an earthquake. So, compound disasters is just the new thing. And so much of the disaster space that I've been in the past, decade or more has been about that silo disaster. So when the bushfires happened, they set up the reactive, government agency or the reactive help agency. But now it can't work that way, because we've got to prepare for and we've got to realize that there's disaster on top of disaster on top of disaster, and they all have direct and indirect consequences as well. So we worked a lot with a lot of, and we're still working with a lot of communities up in the beautiful Blue Mountains region of New South Wales, just out of Sydney. And they are really tourism based. So they lost, tourists couldn't come because of the fires and the, smoke and threat to the communities. And then as they're recovering, COVID hit. So they lost all their international tourists overnight. They lost their regional tourists overnight. They're locked down in LGA. So you've got businesses here that, for 2 years have just been one thing after the other. And I think it's that whole, it's not going to happen to me, is completely out the window. And the whole mindset is right. We need to think differently, and we need to start getting ready.
So what measures have you seen being taken by first the public sector and then by the private sector to sort of begin to address this? Because we are very clear that so much of what we need to get done has to be cross-sector, de-siloed, and really collaborative leadership is the way forward. But what are you witnessing and seeing in Australia in response?
Yeah, so it's been really good, and I have to say, definitely maybe small, but definitely steps forward. So I'm pretty sure last time we spoke, I mentioned here we have a notion of shared responsibility. So it was identified in a national resilience strategy from 2011. So they said that preparedness and resilience is a shared responsibility between individuals, households, businesses, government, emergency services. Obviously not equal, because emergency services have their kind of, fundamental role that we don't want the everyday person to have. But ultimately, we all have to play a role in preparing ourselves and building resilience to the compound multiple natural and other disasters to come. And I think, it was always a word and a phrase that I loved, but it wasn't activated. It was written, but not implemented. Like, you couldn't see it in anything that was happening. After the bushfires, I have to say, particularly in New South Wales, which was the state mostly hit, they set up a Resilience New South Wales. So their whole government structure moved from emergency management and response to resilience. And the leader there, Commissioner Shane Fitzsimmons, is amazing. And if ever you wanted another Australian on your podcast, I'll absolutely introduce you to him, because he is amazing. And he's from a fire background. So them as a state, they've absolutely set themselves up as, one of other states that's sort of leading in that resilience space. We then, of course, had, the typical review and inquiry and royal commission that, millions of dollars are spent to kind of identify what happened. And as a result of that, the Prime Minister here announced a new federal agency that is recovery and resilience. So that means that rather than those responsive, bushfire recovery programs and agencies set up, it's now just recently, I think since the start of the financial year in July, transitioned to a national resilience and recovery agency. And so what that has meant is that there is a lot of funding and a lot of grant programs. I can't tell you how many grants we've had to write, but successfully winning a big chunk of them in the sense of setting up preparedness and resilience. So I think the bushfires, then the COVID, and then so many other compound disasters. And even today, there's a big weather storm, life-threatening weather storm hitting north of our country. So we have to be prepared, because there's going to be more. And I think the language, the funding starting to shift, which is where it should be. So that's pretty exciting. But there's still a long way to come, because I think the last stats were that net 97% of funding in the space went to recovery. Like, that's ludicrous when we know that the dollar invested before is, between 7 and 11 or 14 after. So I think right now, if we're going in the right direction, and we just need to keep going in the right direction.
So I actually love to hear that. And we're seeing a lot of that here too, under FEMA and HUD and USDA. So not only looking at turning on the spigots from the top for resiliency, but also trying to increase access and equity. And we've been really vocal nationally, especially to say to our national leaders, we so appreciate that. But for small rural counties, how are they going to, what can we do together in order to ensure that they have more access? How do we reform the actual grants process so that it's more of a common app, or what we call a TurboTax model, so that it will feed you, you kind of pre-register like you do with your taxes. That's what we do anyway. We have a W-2 form and it pulls all the information. And then, and then if you follow this one program, it'll tell you like what you're eligible for and what you're not. So we're asking them to not only reform what they want to fund, but how is it that people, actually gain access to that funding? So what are you seeing there in that same area? Has it changed? Has it gotten better?
No, there's a long way to go in the funding aspects over here. And in fact, I've got a different state, my own state department. I sent perhaps a relatively direct but factual email just in terms of my experience of certain processes and what we were hearing from communities, and they've asked for a follow-up meeting. So to me, the whole grant program is just backwards. It's completely backwards, and it's predominantly created and run by people who likely have never been impacted by a disaster and likely have never run a grants program before. That's my own opinion. So I'm sure there are people that are not in that bucket. But I think it's, what happened here was at the start of last year, they created these, big grants programs about recovery and resilience. And that's great. And there are hundreds of millions of dollars put into it. And then they open it up for competitive funding. So this is separate to the grants of like where you have been impacted and then you need to apply for your business grant or whatever. That's a different kettle of fish. But what's happened is that basically you've got groups in communities, including councils, including, not-for-profits, including businesses and chambers and that, who are all trying to come up with ideas and work out what they need that fits the eligibility to get some funding. And so a whole lot of this competitive grant process, then it does the opposite to building social capital. And we do a lot of work with Professor Daniel Aldrich from Boston in the States around, connected communities and more resilient than affluent communities. So we've got to connect these communities. You can't connect a community when they're elbowing each other out of the way to try and get some funding. But also those most vulnerable who maybe can't access the digital forms or can't write the right words in the submissions, and like I was writing them, it takes me about 40 hours to write each one. How are they ever going to get funded as well? Yet they're those most vulnerable. And the other side of the fence for those who have been impacted, I'm not joking, when the bushfires happened, there were so many forms and repeated information, and they're looking at streamlining it, but there's a long way to go. And I said, before, it needs to be flipped for me. Let's go to needs led. Let's not go to press release dictated or output numbered. I don't want to know how many grants you've given out. I want to know that you've given the right people are receiving the help in the right way that they need. And that's not a cookie cutter approach. So I think there's a long way to go.
I just want to amen all of that. And one of the things that has been a guiding principle in our organization is we will chase the mission, not the funding, because the funding set is really determines your programming, and it doesn't often match exactly more. I mean, it's better in the past year and a half, but before then there was a huge disconnect between the need we were actually seeing in post-disaster communities and even for resiliency ahead of time. And then the conversation about what people were willing to fund from philanthropy to government funding. And that just, it really skews the entire conversation towards, it actually builds inequities into the system. Side note, with the Biden administration, there's a new focus on building more equity. And we applaud that. We're like, that is wonderful. Thank you. But FEMA released an RFI, a request for input on equity. And so myself and my program director got on there to answer all of the questions that they had. And we have 3 master's degrees, 2 in public policy. She also has an MBA and 3 undergraduate degrees between us, and a lot of policy experience. And it took all of what we had to decipher, what are you even asking? And so by the 3rd one, I was like, it just has to be said that, we have all this education and experience, and I cannot imagine having less education and trying to navigate the questions you're asking about access. And so I would like you to look right here, because this is it in action. And it's just an interesting human, I mean, I didn't create a revolution or anything, but at least it's in writing somewhere.
Oh, 100%. And I think, there's such a disconnect between that high level policy and that grassroots, and we need to work together, and we need to find that commonality in language, but also, everything we do is outcomes. I'm not interested in outputs. So you'll never see, very rarely will you see for us, how many communities we're working with or how many businesses we've helped, because I don't care to that. I want to have business communities that are ready and raring to go. So we are 100% focused on outcomes. And I think that's a really big gap from our government here, because it's very press release driven in terms of, we gave out X $100 million of grants to X participants, and that's going to get X, Y, Z. It shouldn't be that way. It should be that these communities need X, Y, and Z, and here's the way we're going to be there. The biggest thing that I've noticed most recently is resilience. Like, I was advocating federal, state, local governments to build preparedness and resilience for, 2 years before the major bushfires here. And it's not going to happen to us. Not me, nothing, no. Resilience now is such a buzzword, and it's in every piece of funding coming out. So the problem that we have over here is that we've got like overnight resilience experts applying for this funding, and if they have the capabilities to write well, they're getting funding. And I'm having conversations with not-for-profits and other leading organizations that I spoke to 2 years ago, and we're like, let's collaborate and do things, and they're like, oh no, we do sustainability, we don't do resilience. And like, now they're ringing me up saying, oh, we do resilience. And I was like, oh wow, that's amazing. How long have you been doing resilience then as a cultural strategic priority? 3 weeks. And I'm like, no, but Jennifer, that's like, it's funny, but it's not funny.
It's not funny, but it's damage. So true.
Damage from those overnight experts that are chasing the funding, who have no idea about community disasters, impacts, recovery. That is frightening. So I'm quite bewildered by the sharks chasing the funding, and I'm possibly a little bit vocal about it when I need to be too.
Well, but I think that there's, we had this lesson this year where people started contacting me about this organization. I won't name them. And they're like, have you heard of them? Because they were very aggressive in their outreach, and they aren't bad people, to be clear, but this is not what they were tasked to do and given all of these state grants to do. They are not qualified to do, by any stretch of the imagination. And so I got on a call with one of their not the CAO, but somebody high up, and I was like, what are you doing? like the damage that you can do from not knowing. And this person said to me, look, we didn't even necessarily want these contracts. We applied for one on a whim, and we got it because of our background, but we have to actually turn around and say to the people who are the practitioners on the ground, you are not X, Y, and Z that we have been contracted for. But the state actually threw another 16 contracts at them. And they are like, they're going to end this year. And so I sent them contracts, contracts that they could apply for, that they were qualified for and would do no harm. And so I think that they sort of, it's like looking at a gift albatross in the mouth, where you're like, well, no, I don't want your, $13 million. Of course they do.
Exactly. Yeah.
But the damage is, is big. And then a lot of people just rushing into the space because they're chasing the money. And our position is, thank you, welcome. We want you here with us too, but you have to be ethical. And I know, and so I'm seeing the exact same thing. Yeah.
And we're about, bring the money and give the money out, but we're all about co-design here, and at corporate to community, our models are collective models, so we don't have people just sitting waiting with various experience. We have a whole network of people with the right experience, because in those communities there's everything from stakeholder engagement to risk compliance management to risk reduction, like expertise. You got to bring the right people in at the right time for the right purpose, not just have these credible organizations and great at what they've been doing for 20 years. But, the harm, that's the thing for me. If, you can imagine those inexperienced, unskilled people in this sector going into those communities and businesses and business industries, and the advice, it's just going to be so harmful.
So, and, not only to the people that they are tasked with serving, but I talked to one of the people who was working for them, because finally I was like, I'll meet with one of these people. And what I saw was that the person,
we're so similar.
I know. This is why Brooks Nelson was like, you two should know each other. What I saw was a person really traumatized. He was well aware of what he wasn't qualified to do. And then he was in that stage, which we've all seen post disaster, where people are like, I got to help, I got to do everything, and I need to do everything. And people need everything. And I don't know how to do it. And so I'm like Googling madly, and he had veered way off even the mission that he was qualified for, to the mission that he wasn't qualified for, to all the way into housing and permitting. And I was like, first of all, you need to take care of yourself, because that is not sustainable, what's happening to you now. And I'm not mad at anybody but the system, though, has to be more, the system has to be more responsive, and the system has to listen. And that's hard to do when you are serving literally millions of people, but it doesn't mean it's impossible to do.
No, and 100%. And, again, we've been reaching out to, our key focus is businesses and business industries and business communities. And we've been reaching out to certain associations for a number of years saying, hey, let's collaborate. And even, they didn't have resilience on their agenda. They had other things, industrial relations and that. But now they're coming to us and saying, we tried to do something in the response, and 30%, maybe 50% was really great. 50% was just didn't work because we had the wrong people. So let's now collaborate. And by collaborating with us, it's like, well, great. So we know that there's going to be a surge capacity, whatever the next disaster impact is, wherever it will happen. So collaborate with us. We'll help you with your secretariat in the good times, but we will get all those corporates that are your members to train their people so that when the bad times hit, you're not sending in a, director level person who just seems to want to do something different with their role into an environment that they've never experienced. And it's disastrous for the corporate helping, but it's also really disastrous for the community. So it goes back to, preparedness and resilience and that shared responsibility. We can all play a role. And if we prepare ourselves and set ourselves up for those times when, a lot more support and help is going to be needed, well, let's do it. It's great. People building, connection building, training, I think it's a whole new skill set. Which,
I think that one of the things that you said that is so important is when you mentioned code designing, and I just want to highlight that for a minute, because I get all excited because it's not that often that I know people. I don't know that many people like you and I who do very, very similar things and have that kind of unique organization in this space that is very bottom up. And no heroes, no saviors. You're not even allowed. Don't come near me. I can't with you. And because I understand the human response to want to be a hero and a savior, but it's super dysfunctional and re-traumatizes the people in front of you if you do not keep your promises because you don't even know how. And so the co-designing, we are so clear that when we go into a community post-disaster that we must listen. We do not want to lead their disaster. We don't do that. We're like, we'll learn with you and we will bring you resources and adaptable systems and refer to you. And we are here for community-led and designed disaster recovery and resiliency. And you have to actually do recovery, do resiliency. It's like everyone wants, everyone talks about equity, but how do you actually do it instead of just checking the mark? So can you go in more deeply to the concept of code design? Because I think it's critically important.
Yeah, so we're a social enterprise here, which means we're not a not-for-profit, but we're not a for-profit. We're in the middle. So our whole purpose is about building resilient businesses, helping communities thrive, and leading collaborations. So the leading collaborations, we see a really important role for us to advocate the top-down kind of approach, but we do it with 100% commitment to that bottom-up. So any program or project that we run, and we're winning like millions of dollars in grants to run projects and pilot projects, everything has a co-design approach. So we set up working groups in the local government areas or the regions. We invite, the councils, the emergency services, the not-for-profits, the business chambers, a whole cohort of, local experts and that. And we have conversations with them for like a couple of months before we start implementing anything to really understand. So we've just won one on Kangaroo Island, which is in South Australia, a beautiful island that just got absolutely decimated from the bushfires, like lost half of their environmental, plantations and that. Oh. Yeah. And so it's 18 months or more later, and we're just about to start going in to help them because they're almost ready. Now, we know that they're not going to come out, like the businesses there are not going to come out for someone coming in to say, let's talk about business resilience. So we're working with people on the ground there, and I'm like, okay, well, let's have a bingo night at the pub and let's call out bingo numbers relating to resilience. And they're like, what? And it's like, well, we need to co-design and come to you and work with what's already working in the community. So I'm not going to roll up and go, hey, here's the Renae van. Let's talk about business resilience and preparedness. No, let's say, well, where are you meeting? What are you doing? What's important to you? Having those conversations that's needs led, because there's no one that understands the community more than the community itself. In saying that, there are communities within communities. So my background is stakeholder engagement, which is absolutely fundamental for the conversations and the planning and the response and recovery, because you've got to understand the loudest is not always right. It's usually the quiet
it's usually not right.
The quiet person sitting in the corner that you watch everyone else just look to see how they're responding, and then how they respond, the others respond. So you've got to pick out those, I understand those people within the communities, and then really, find those vulnerable people and ask them, what do you need? And there's a perceived need and there's a real need. And then there's the assumption of who should deliver that. So we have a lot of conversations in communities with businesses, and it's like, that's what you need. Love that you've identified that. You think council should do that for you. I'm going to tell you, no, they shouldn't. So let's work out how you as a group, as a business group, can do that yourselves. And that's the exciting part, because I think once they understand the roles of all the different players, the needs that they have, they can then start that process and journey to say, okay, we need to empower ourselves, and we need help. So we're bringing partners in that, but we need to lead, the direction that's right for us to get to the outcome that's right for us. And that's really different in every community. So you can't do that cookie cutter.
You can't. And it's, I sometimes I say, like, even sometimes they'll, the local community leaders, this happened again this year, where they'll say, hey, what I really want to do is you'll tell us how to do this. You can take over that. And I'm always like, no, actually what I'm going to do is I'm going to teach you how to do it. We're actually going to break here for a minute because we have a little commercial break. And if you haven't yet hit like, subscribe, or follow, please do so. And we will be back in just a few seconds, under 30. Thank you.
This podcast is sponsored by Fire Safe Signs. In a disaster, seconds matter. Fire Safe Signs give first responders critical information like, can a fire truck make it down the driveway? What water sources are available? Fire Safe Signs help property owners provide crucial information to first responders, and they're made in the USA. Getting this information in seconds helps save lives. Together, we make our community safe. Visit us today at firesafesigns.com.
Okay, so welcome back to the podcast. On today's show, I'm so happy to have back Renae Hanvin, the founder and director of Corporate to Community. She is based in Melbourne, Australia. So thank you again. So we were just getting into, though, now I want to get right back to it because I love this topic. Even in the trauma response, when somebody is asking you to do a bigger role, when you were talking about being ready to come in 18 months, that's when people are really ready for you. Can you talk about long-term disaster and how a trauma response at the beginning does not look the same 12 to 18 months out? And people who who do this work have to bear that in mind, that people may ask you to do stuff that's not your place and is not actually what's best for them in the long term or their community.
Yeah, it's really, I mentioned just before the break that, my background is stakeholder engagement and stakeholder relations. So I guess I've got a lot of years behind me to understand the people, and I can pick up the cues in terms of what people are saying, but what they're really saying, and then who's not saying it. So I mentioned before that I'm really interested in those that are not saying. The other thing that I'm always first to look out for is who's not in the room, who's missing, who hasn't been invited, or who hasn't decided to turn up, and why not. So I'll be there ticking lists and, mapping them all out. But I think the reality is that, every community is different, and every community can prepare differently. Every community has different responses and levels of resilience, and every community recovers differently. And then people in those communities recover differently too. So you can't necessarily take a whole community and say, right, bang, we're going to do this weekend workshop and you're resilient. Yeah. So it's got to be an evolving process. And we've seen a lot of really great communities up in the Dandenongs here who, they've had leaders in their communities who've set up like music festivals. So every year they have a music festival. Now that's partly about having music, partly about bringing the community together, but they use that, and they use it specifically to test their fire response systems. So it's a great idea.
I love that.
Yeah, like September, October, just before, going into the next bushfire season here. And they have it. So they test the partners, they test the emergency services, they have a meeting. And so the process of planning for the music festival is actually about planning for the potential recovery at the same time. So I think there are, many, many ways. We like to work on things as a do it yourself. Do it with you or do it together. We never, ever, ever go into anything that's a do it for you. We'll help you, but we never do it for you. So we taught the language and how we approach things. It's like, well, this is what you might like to do. So how about you go and do that? And those that are willing and happy and have the skills to do that can do that. Others, it's like, well, let us help facilitate a session or something with the random people in the community, and we'll see if we can find a commonality. And the commonality might be just that everyone's got a mobile phone. So we start there. So we find that, okay, you all hate each other and you all want different things, but you've all got a mobile phone. So how can we use the mobile phone to connect or to communicate, or what's that purpose? And then the other thing, is the do it together. So it's like, right, we've identified that it's not council's responsibility to do this, or they can play that role. So let's come together and then work out who's going to do what, and collectively we get to that outcome. And I think there are three really good ways to sort of approach the strategic aspects of it, because it's never about me, and it's never about me not wanting to help, because I tell you, I want to help every person that I meet, like exactly like you, but I can't. And I also am very aware of where I fit in the pie. I'm not an emergency responder. I'm not a government, support worker. I'm not a Red Cross support worker. So knowing who I can connect people with, and that's a big part of what we do too. It's like, I get what you're saying. I can't help you, but I know who can. And you follow that up so you connect them in the right direction. But
you as keep I said, all those promises too. Like if you say you're going to follow up, you must be accountable. And I think that's like, it has to be such an internal core value of an organization like yours or mine, that has to be
100%. You always close the loop. Even, even with the media, you always close the loop in the sense that you always want to make sure that you can tick that task or that need, and that you're comfortable and that they're in the hands of other people, or that they're doing it themselves. 100%. So important, because there's nothing worse for a community that is recovering, and then particularly recovering while they're also in the middle of another one. So like COVID on top of bushfires, and they know there's going to be more. So if you're not, if you're leaving them hanging in limbo, that's the worst thing you do. You're better off not going in there in the first place.
How do you address though that call? You sort of you talked about this earlier, that a lot of grant making organizations in the government, they want to know like what numbers. And I just got this question from a philanthropy group the other day, and they love our work and they're so happy, but they have to put something down on paper, and like, well, how are you going to work in community X? It's a community that we're working in now, and I said, what's that? He's like, what's that going to look like over the next year? And I said, I don't know yet, because I have to listen and I have to see, like, the levers of recovery are not, they're not the same for every community. Now we want to case study it and document it, but I'm not going to sit here and tell you specifically it's X, Y, and Z when they may need like D, F, and G, and I have to actually listen. That's an uncomfortable place for funders though to live, because they have to do their due diligence. How do you deal with that?
Yeah. So I have two key questions. I always go back and say, why? Why is that important? Why are the numbers important? And I find that a really interesting approach, because then they think about, well, why are they important? And I think that to me goes back to the outcome versus the outputs. So I lead the conversation into, is it more important for me to help 2,000 families or move the whole community to this point? So I find it's an education process. And then if they say, well, we have to have numbers in the submission, and we have to submit numbers into certain grant programs. I do really teeny tiny numbers. I just do big, big, big outcomes. And so I say, well, what do you think the numbers to be? Or what do you need the numbers to be? And if those numbers sound possible, I go, okay, well, we'll do our best and we'll aim to try and meet those numbers. But we're delivering to the outcome. Because what that does too is sometimes they don't know what the numbers have to be. So when you go back to them to say, well, why do you need numbers and what do you want them to be? They get to the point where they're like, well, it's not really about numbers, is it? I was like, no. So then you can kind of, help them in that education part to go back to their funders and say, so why do we need these numbers, or do we really need those numbers, or can't we just focus on this being the outcome, that after 2 years of working with these communities, we go from X to Y, and yes, you can have participants and all that kind of thing. But again, every community is different and not everything works in all the communities, and, that's okay too.
And I try to, that's actually, I'm going to totally take that advice, because I found myself avoiding those conversations because I don't want to make a promise or say I'm going to do something to a funder either that I don't know yet is possible. So I'd rather show them, like, here over the past 4 years, here's what we have done. Here's where we have been. Here's what we're learning. And here's what we believe will happen. But in our case, I'm like, I need you to understand that the prevalence of mega fires and compound disasters here is pretty new. And so I really don't want to, I will not fudge that. I will not, and so I love that answer. I'm totally going to try that out, because that's been a point of confusion. And sometimes I'm like, is there something wrong with me that's not at all where I think the direction should be? And I'm also like saying to them, I'm so glad you're here and that you want to come along for this journey. Like, you can come along with this journey with us. You can call me anytime or ask for just a snapshot of how it's going there. And what are you seeing? And what are the long-term recovery, what are we hearing? And what also really cool things are they doing? I was so pleased the other day because we're working in this one little town called Greenville.
Yeah.
And you probably saw in the news, and it burned down like 90%. And I was all excited the other day because some other partners that we're working with in Malibu, they were like, do you know about Greensburg, Kansas? And they rebuilt and they were about the same size. And so I sent all the information off to Greenville. And then I got a text that night from the supervisor. They'd already sent a delegation. They already knew this. And so it gave me chills of joy because they were ahead of me. And that means that they're not always going to be ahead, but I was like, because they have capacity. And even though they're a tiny rural community, they have enough emergent leaders that we can support them in other ways, but they are also dedicated to innovating their way out of this. And they were ahead. It was just a wonderful moment. A funder doesn't want to hear that though. Do you know?
No, 100%. And I think like I go to funders or corporates or anyone who wants to come on board, and I'm like, why? What do you want out of this? So really clearly in the conversations, I have that really direct, like, let's just call a spade a spade. So what do you want? Do you want brand reputation? Do you want to be in press releases? Do you want your staff to think that you're amazing as an employer of choice because you're helping here? Or are you doing it, silently and you don't really want anyone to know? Because I think if you can understand that from the funder perspective early, you can then understand what you need to share back with them, or what they need to, I guess, get the internal approvals and, for their job to be sort of shining as well. And I think it's a really good way to set it up right from the start. So when you talk about the money, great, you're going to give us X million dollars or whatever, amazing, we could do so much for that. What do you actually want to see from it? So what do you want? And then you can have, again, it's education as well, because a lot of people, so a lot of corporates we're finding used to put big millions of dollars into trust funds waiting for the next disaster. So when the next disaster happened, and we had, a fair few years there that there were no major ones, dare I say. So then when the bushfires happened, there were billions of, tens, 20, $30 million sitting in these trust funds. So we're having conversations now with these corporates to say, well, why don't you reallocate it to, a resilience building initiative or something like that? And they're like, oh, well, that's not going to get the same media coverage, and, communities won't know that we're there to help when something happens. I was like, they'll know that you're helping them before, which I think is more important. And we can remind them when the disaster happens that you've been helping them before. But tracking that and getting the social impact measurement is really hard, because again, it's not we're giving $10 million at the time of disaster, which is that quick snap. It's, well, over 3 years, we're giving $20 million to go from A to B, but we're not going to find, the measurements and you can't change a community and a culture overnight. So you've got to do it gradually. And I have
to put a pin in. I have to highlight that, because it's the reason why people don't really like to enter into long-term disaster recovery, because it is a slog. It is a grind, and it is not that sexy. And you and I have talked about this before. But people are more interested in it sort of at the tail end of the pandemic, entering into an endemic, where they're like, oh, well, maybe this does take years, and maybe they're more, and we are seeing a major shift just, and I do credit COVID. So some good things will come out of that, but it's not a quick hit. That's for sure. It's a long slog, but the results though, are that is like doing resiliency as opposed to doing heroics.
100%. And look, I absolutely agree with you. I think after the bushfires and after tornadoes and after storms and all that kind of here, if it wasn't for COVID, nothing would have changed. We would have, and I'm not joking, even though we have had multiple compounds, those, quick impact ones, it would have been the same. COVID has been horrific, and you never would want anything like that in a million years. But I think that's been the game changer, particularly in the business community sense too, because it's because of COVID impacting businesses, which impact livelihoods that impact lives. And I think that's where, the focus around, well, hang on a minute, we have to think differently and we have to do differently. And, it is that we've got to prepare better, but it is taking longer to recover, but we don't want it to take that long to recover. So if we get ready more before, so that's why I think the COVID has enabled a mindset shift and a funding shift, which I think is a really, really positive thing. And again, you would not wish it at all, but I just hope that it lasts. I hope it's not like they say pandemics last for 3 years. So I hope it's not when the pandemic finishes that we all just go back to oh no, it won't happen again, we'll be right. So, we'll just do that reactive kind of approach and funding. I really hope it's the start of a cultural change across the globe, in that sense of, just having more awareness and education and capability building to be able to get prepared and then know how to adapt.
It's one of the great challenges and lessons and ironies of COVID is that when the world requires we do a group project and we are the most divided, and I don't think those things are much of a coincidence. But I too hope that at the, by year 3, maybe, which we're going to enter into pretty soon here, that we start to sort of take those lessons. And I was thinking about this recently when I was watching, we had this you may have seen it. It was a condo collapse in Florida. And, a lot of, there were like 150 people, middle of the night, collapses. And what I noticed is that when people were talking about it on television and FEMA did go in and offer assistance, that nobody was like, can you please tell me your political background before I pull your relatives out of this, out of the rubble? Can you please tell me how much you make a year? And can you identify your demographic and see whether or not I'm on your team or you're on my team? And instead it was like team human.
Yeah.
And I like team human. I mean, that's a place I can totally live. And, you know, I may have completely different politics from somebody, but I can shake their hand. And as long as we agree on the playing field, which, you know, that seems to be in play over here anyway, that we're going to be fine on the other side. And so maybe in year 3, that'll be the case. But I have recounted that analogy many times to people who are also coming to me and saying, well, you know, we definitely want to help in disaster, but we have this very narrow group of people that we're willing to help. And sometimes I can find that swath of people that they're interested in, and I'm happy to connect them. And other times I'm like, well, that's not the people who actually are in the rubble. So what are you going to do with, like, I'm looking at the rubble in front of me, and those are the people that we need to serve. And it, you know, it's anyway, so I'm sure that happens.
Yeah, 100%. And again, I go back, you know, one of my favorite questions is why. And I think, you know, if people are coming to help and, you know, they've got their pre-notion in terms of how they want that help to help, that's based on their own level of education and experience in the space. And most of those funders are not, you know, disaster response or recovery experts. So I think there's a really, you know, now's a really great time for that education around, okay, that's what you say you want, but like, why do you want that? Because then you could educate them to go, well, you know, did you know that these are other needs and these are other groups as well? And some have their, you know, in their clauses or their governance processes, that's all they can do. So that is what it is. But the majority of them, they just don't know. You know, they have this perception of what they should be doing, but they don't know of what the real needs is. And now at C2C, we're all about needs led. So I will never go into any grant program or go and present or pitch or ask for funding on something that is just a pie in the sky idea. Everything for us has to be grassroots, community, needs led. And real needs, not perceived needs. And then we are off and running. So everything we do has to have an outcome that it's delivering directly to a need. And the whole, we're waiting to hear about a couple of big grants here, but one of them is focused on, you know, setting communities up to receive goodwill. So goodwill and giving before, not just during, but setting them up to receive that help before. And it's so that we're not, you know, putting the small businesses out of business that didn't get impacted by the disaster, but the wealth of free food and donations that come in after the bushfires put them out of business because no one bought from them. So setting up the systems and processes so that, you know, we can give better, we can help better, we're helping before, and then we're, you know, not harmfully helping in the during as well. So big education piece.
It is amazing how much harm is accidental and comes from, you know, great intentions. We saw that in our fires after. I may have mentioned this before, you know, that there was this sort of food place, anyway, this hot meals place continued to go for months. But it undermined accidentally all the small businesses around it that actually we needed some money to circulate in the economy. So we're not saying there shouldn't always be a place to go get a free lunch. I'm okay with that. But like the amount and the number in the outreach, and it was so like, well, why would I go spend money at the, you know, small Latino market over there when I can go right next door and get it for free? You know,
100%. And, you know, in that context, like the wildfires or the bushfires are the disaster, but for that little general store that's been the epicenter of that community, it's actually the aftermath of the free roll-ups that's the disaster for that business. And the disaster for that business then becomes a disaster for the community when that business goes under because they can't keep trading. And then that whole town, after the impact and everyone's packed up and left, that town doesn't have a general store. So then all those people then have to drive, you know, kilometers, miles, you know, to get essential products and services because they can't recover and come back. That's the disaster too.
And then you've lost a community member, like an element of the community where people gather, where people talk, where people connect. And that's often, we talked about this before, in a small business, and how, you know, there are ways that, but you're right. Like if you build it ahead of time, then you'll know what to do. And it's not going to be perfect. It's, you know, it's not going to go exactly as you thought it was going to, but it has like a much better chance of coming out the other side with your community intact. And that includes your small businesses, because the other thing that kind of went wrong in that situation was like every policy maker would go there and then take a photo of themselves and like, oh, I'm giving out free. And you're like, oh my God, you know what? You're also ruining the small business right next door. And I know you don't mean it that way, but you're also in charge of all the decisions. And so it was like, it's hard to get mad at people for thinking that they're doing the exact right thing, but it can be infuriating in the space of disaster when you're like, did you ask? Did you ask did you do a community assessment? Did you ask the other stakeholders who are not at the table like you do?
Exactly. And, you know, I've done a lot of consequence stakeholder mapping for the Victoria Emergency Services Department and government bodies and whatnot. And everything has a consequence. So every decision you make, it has a risk and it has a consequence. So you might decide to stand in front of a certain shop and say a certain message. And the consequence of that might be that the message you're saying impacts that shop and then they lose sales. So, you know, or the fire truck comes and parks outside a driveway, which the consequence means that no customers can get in and out of the, you know, the car wash or something like that. So I think it's that understanding and having clarity and really sort of resonating and recognizing where you are and what you're wanting to do and who that can impact, because it can have really devastating impacts, positive, but also negative. And I think in that instant response, when yes, the politicians are rolling into town and it's, you know, happy snap land and everyone's coming to help. But the reality is that, you know, do they want your help? Have they asked for your help? Are you helping them with what they need? Or are you just literally there for yourself? Because so much is about, you know, well, I want to help, so I'm telling you what you need, or I'm telling you that I'm here. Well, quite frankly, who cares? Like, it's got to go the other way. It's got to be starting with what's the need, asking the community, getting permission from the community, and then supporting the community.
And I think the community has a good opportunity here to calm down and actually ask also, because they will say like a social media can be such a gift to community in a disaster or in any situation, but it can also be such a huge liability where it's like, well, why aren't you doing this perfectly just for me in the way that I want you to at the time period I have set forth? And so I think that in politicians and leaders in particular builds a sort of toxic circular relationship where they are trying to fill, you know, trying to like hyper, like, yes, I'm doing all of this. And there's almost no time to really ask the people who aren't as vocal, is this what you needed? Was this effective? Instead, you have to move on to the next demand for, you know, I like to say when we demand gods, we inherit monsters. And that's what, you know, that's kind of the space that I think that we're in politically is it's all about it's so image based and so not outcomes based. And I think that that's just preaching to your choir, but I think social media certainly can, you know, contributes to it.
Well, social media has just put everything in a whole other kind of context too as well, because, you know, you can have someone can put up one tiny comment that's completely personal out of context and that blows up, and then, you know, the whole community gets impacted by it. I think moving back to your comment about the politicians and you know, images and whatnot, so, you know, in Australia, not the bushfires or others, but the COVID has just been a political, I don't know how to say this without saying a rude Aussie word, so I won't say that. Like I think
you can say it. It's just, I think you're allowed.
No, I think you might have to bleep it over there because I know you have different words you can and can't say. But it's just been a nightmare because the whole COVID response is political. Yeah. So, you know, we are locked down because our state kind of politician is different to the federal politician. So they just fight and just like, you know, big note arm wrestle each other. And then we're the ones who are like locked down, not being able to do anything. And I think, I know I've kind of joked to certain people, and it's not my role to lead this, but I've certainly mentioned to people that we need a national referendum whereby emergency resilience and response is taken away from our states and goes to the federal level. And I'm not saying it's right for every country, but over here, it's been despicable how we've been treated and what, support that we have to get through COVID. And then what other states around the country have. Like, it's ridiculous. And it's just politically led. It's 1,000% politically led. And I think even to the point where, and I'm sure I mentioned last time, bushfires go over state lines, but the trucks can't. So you get to a border and the fire truck can't go over and help the people because we have different laws, different governance, different, ways to put the fire out. So it's ludicrous. It should be, in my view, it should be a national approach that we're all Australians. We all deserve to have the same level of preparedness, the best level we can, and the same response, in any type of disaster. So I think that's a fair way off, though.
Well, it is a fair way off, but there has to be something good that comes out of this. And I will say that, working in disaster, I resisted, having to bring people along in the story of what we do when we go out on deployments, because I was like, why would I go in there and take a selfie? Because I flipping hated that during our disasters. And then I realized in the past couple of years that I have to go in and do that, because then people need to root for somebody. They need to root for a person. And so I have a very conflicted relationship with that reality. Like so I just want to acknowledge that I totally have not resolved that feeling, but I have reconciled the fact that until I made myself visible, and people were like, I'm going to tell your story for you. And they were invariably going to be wrong. So
and I think we're so similar, which is why I love always catching up with you. And again, Brooks, Nelson connected us.
Shout out to Brooks Nelson.
Yeah, love. Mm-hmm. I'm the same. So I hate taking photos of myself, and I go into communities and businesses and it's about them. It's not about me. But when they started saying to me, but we trust you, we know what you're doing, we know what your intent is, so you need to be sharing that with others. We're in the process of rebranding, got some really exciting things coming up at the start of next year. And the whole premise around it is about humanizing us to help you, because, in many ways, people say to me, well, you're like the favorite primary school teacher because, everyone wants to be in your class because you're sort of engaging, and we know that you want to help us learn, but you also enable us to get there in our own pace. And I'm like, wow, okay, that's exactly the sort of person I want to be in the space. Mm-hmm. But then only those who come into my class would know that, but ultimately the whole school community should know that. So it's a hard personal, I don't feel comfortable at all, but I think there's a fine balance. And as long as you do it respectfully, I think it's, helping others, I think it's okay.
Yeah. I love our parallel paths in that way. And you've been in this longer than I have, but it is like sort of like the state of the world though is in the same place. So, I mean, I could talk to you, for another like 2 hours because, it's in some ways it's like a colleague experience that I don't often have. I do have it with my colleague, Charles Brooks from Rebuild Paradise Foundation. And my staff is great, but we're such a unique organization and you're such a unique organization. And I will say it's been nice to hear people actually like get it for the first time in the past couple of years, or in the last 6 months in particular. They're like, I'm still doing that. Okay. But I just really appreciate you, Renae. And, I love that we're both on Team Human and all the way in. And so I'm hoping that we make this a thing that we do maybe every 6 to 12 months, even like, there'd always be an open invitation for you to be on this podcast or just to jump on a Zoom call to catch up when there are no cameras anywhere.
No, absolutely. No, I mean, I love chatting with you. And again, I think we are exactly on the same path. And I think we've got so many things in common. And I love what you're doing and catching up with it on Facebook and that, even though we're many, many, many miles away, I feel like I'm a little part of following your story, and what you're doing over there is just amazing as well. And, people like us are needed. So I think we need to support each other and, complement each other and help each other to continue. And who knows, maybe one day when we get out of, whatever lockdown for 48.0, and the world perhaps goes back to, dare I say, a little bit normal, we can catch up face to face, because that would be really special.
We just got a travel partner. I won't say who it is, but that may be possible. So, I will get all the confirmation in another 30 days, but really is going to make a huge difference in our ability to take delegations but also they were like, you need to go to conferences. I'm like, we do. And in my brain, I'm like, oh, I'd like to go see Renae in Australia and tour all of their systems.
Let's make it happen. I reckon there's some white paper or research project that we need to do. So let's talk about that.
We totally do. So once again, our guest today on the podcast is Renae Hanvin. She is the founder and director of Corporate to Community, and she is a good friend of After the Fire and a wonderful colleague and a thought leader in this space. So we are going to drop all of her information in the links, and we highly encourage you to check out her website. She too has a podcast and doing disasters differently. And we highly encourage you to listen in on that as well and support her work. So thank you again.
Thanks so much. So great to chat with you. We'll see you again soon.
See you again soon. Thank you for joining us on the podcast, How to Disaster. For more information, please visit our website at afterthefireusa.org. And if you liked this video, please hit subscribe.
Fannie Mae provides mortgage options for you and your family. If you have a mortgage owned by Fannie Mae, you may have financial options available after a disaster, such as forbearance plans, deferral of payments, lending assistance, and counseling. Find out more from our Disaster Response Network. Go online at www.knowyouroptions.com/relief or call 1-877-833-1746 today.